My entire family betrayed me for my inheritance. I made them all pay. Hey, souls, I'm Jennifer, and I'm about to tell you the most insane family betrayal story that literally destroyed my entire extended family. When my grandmother died and left me a $3.2 million inheritance, I thought I was blessed. But what I discovered was that my own mother, my sister, my aunt, my uncle, and my cousins had been plotting for months to steal my inheritance and leave me with nothing. They thought they were so clever, manipulating a grieving granddaughter while planning to forge documents and commit fraud. But here's where it gets absolutely wild. My revenge didn't just expose their scheme, it destroyed all of their lives. My mother lost her house and her job, my sister got arrested for fraud, my aunt and uncle went bankrupt, my cousins lost their college funds, and I? Well, I not only kept my inheritance but also sued them for an additional $1.8 million in damages. Oh, and I made sure the whole town knew exactly what kind of people they really were. This story has literally everything: family greed, forged documents, stolen identities, FBI investigations, and the kind of revenge that turned Thanksgiving dinner into a courtroom drama. Y'all ready for this tea? Because this is how I single-handedly destroyed my entire toxic family tree. Alright y'all, I need to start by explaining my family dynamics because honestly, this story has more characters than a soap opera, and you need to understand who all these people are before I tell you how they tried to destroy me. So I'm 28 years old, and up until 8 months ago, I thought I had this amazing, close-knit family. My grandmother Eleanor was basically the matriarch of our whole family. She owned this beautiful Victorian house in Savannah, Georgia, and had built up a pretty impressive fortune through real estate investments over the years. Now, my family tree gets complicated, so bear with me here. My mom Linda is 52 and works as a manager at a local bank. She's divorced from my dad, who lives in California and isn't really part of this story. My younger sister Ashley is 24 and was working as a dental hygienist while living in an apartment that my mom helped pay for. Then there's my mom's sister, my Aunt Patricia, who's 49 and married to my Uncle Richard. They have 2 kids, my cousins. Brandon, who's 26 and in grad school, and Melissa, who's 22 and just graduated college. Patricia works part-time at a boutique, and Richard owns a small construction company that's, well, let's just say it's not exactly thriving. And here's where it gets important. My grandmother Eleanor absolutely adored me. I was her first grandchild, and from the time I was little, she always said I reminded her of herself when she was young. I spent every weekend at Grandma's house growing up, helped her with her garden, listened to her stories about building her real estate business from nothing. Meanwhile, my mom and Aunt Patricia had always been kind of competitive about Grandma's attention and money. They'd make little comments about who Grandma liked better, who she spent more time with, who she trusted more with important decisions. Don't get me wrong, we all seemed like a loving family on the surface. We had these big Sunday dinners at Grandma's house every week, celebrated all the holidays together, took family vacations to the beach every summer. From the outside, we probably looked like the perfect Southern family. But looking back now, I can see there were always these undercurrents of tension about money and inheritance. My mom and Patricia would make comments about how expensive Grandma's house was to maintain, how she should have think about the future, and make sure her affairs were in order. My cousins Brandon and Melissa were always really sweet to me, but I noticed they'd get kind of weird whenever Grandma would talk about her will or mention leaving things to family members. Ashley, my sister, was usually more focused on her own life, but she'd definitely perk up whenever inheritance came up in conversation. And Uncle Richard, okay, y'all, Uncle Richard was always the one who seemed most interested in Grandma's money. He'd make these jokes about how he could really use an investor for his construction business, or how Grandma's house would be worth so much if it was renovated properly. About a year ago, Grandma started showing signs of dementia. It was subtle at first, she'd forget names occasionally, repeat stories, or get confused about what day it was. But over the months, it got progressively worse. As her condition declined, my mom and Aunt Patricia started taking more control of Grandma's affairs. They said they were helping by managing her finances, organizing her medical care, and making sure she was safe in her big house. I was working as a marketing coordinator for a tech company here in Atlanta, about 4 hours from Savannah, so I couldn't visit as often as I wanted. But every time I did visit, I noticed that Mom and Patricia seemed to be making more and more decisions for Grandma without really consulting the rest of the family. They hired a home health aide named Carmen. They organized Grandma's medications. They even convinced her to give them power of attorney just in case something happened. At the time, I thought they were being responsible and caring. Grandma would still have her lucid moments where she was completely herself, and during those times, she'd always tell me how much she loved me and how proud she was of the woman I'd become. "Jennifer, you're the only one who visits me because you actually want to spend time with me, not because you want something," she'd say. Now, here's something important. Grandma had always been very open about her will and her plans for her estate. She'd tell all of us that she wanted to make sure everyone in the family was taken care of, but that the bulk of her estate would go to whoever she felt would use it wisely and honor her memory. Over the years, Grandma had made different comments to different family members about her inheritance plans. She'd told my mom that she wanted her to have the family jewelry. She'd mentioned to Patricia that she hoped someone would keep the family house. She'd talked to Brandon about helping with his graduate school expenses. But to me, she'd always been more specific. "Jennifer," she'd say, "you have the same entrepreneurial spirit I had when I was young. I want you to use my money to build something meaningful, not just spend it on frivolous things." I honestly never thought too much about inheritance because I was focused on building my own career in life. But apparently, everyone else in my family was thinking about it a lot more than I realized. About 6 months before Grandma died, Mom and Patricia started organizing these family meetings to discuss Grandma's care and plan for the future. At first, these seemed totally reasonable. We'd talk about medical decisions, whether Grandma should move to assisted living, how to manage her finances. But I started noticing that these meetings often happened when I couldn't attend because of work, and then I'd get these vague summaries of what was discussed. When I'd ask for more details, Mom would say things like, "Oh, it was just boring. Logistical stuff, nothing you need to worry about." During the meetings I did attend, I noticed that my family members kept bringing up concerns about Grandma's mental state and whether she was competent to make important decisions. They'd talk about how confused she seemed and how we needed to protect her from making mistakes. At the time, I thought they were genuinely concerned about Grandma's well-being. But now I realize they were building a case for why any recent changes to her will might not be valid. Grandma's health declined rapidly over her last 3 months. She had a series of small strokes that left her much more confused and dependent on others for daily care. During this time, my family became very protective of access to Grandma. They'd coordinate her care schedule, manage her visitors, and basically control who could see her and when. I noticed that whenever I'd call to check on Grandma or plan a visit, Mom or Patricia would have reasons why it wasn't a good time. "She's having a bad day," or "the doctor said she needs rest," or "she gets too confused when there are too many visitors." When I did manage to visit, Grandma seemed more confused than ever, but she'd still have these moments of clarity where she'd grab my hand and say things like, "Promise me you'll be smart with money, Jennifer. Don't let anyone take advantage of you." Looking back, I think Grandma was trying to warn me about something, but at the time I just thought she was worried about general financial responsibility. Y'all, Grandma passed away on a Tuesday morning. in March, and honestly, even though we'd been expecting it, losing her was devastating. She'd been such a central part of our family for so long, and the house felt so empty without her. The funeral was this huge affair. Grandma had been really involved in the community, so there were like 300 people there. Our whole family was playing the part of the grieving relatives, and everyone was talking about what a wonderful woman Grandma had been and how much she'd be missed. About a week after the funeral, Grandma's lawyer, Mr. Thompson, called to schedule a meeting for the reading of the will. He said all the family members mentioned in the will needed to be present, which included me, Mom, Ashley, Patricia, Richard, Brandon, and Melissa. Now, let me tell you what I was expecting. Based on all the conversations over the years, I figured Grandma had probably left the house to Mom and Patricia to share, maybe left some money for Brandon's education, and probably given everyone some family heirlooms or smaller amounts. I thought I might get like $50,000 or maybe $100,000 if I was lucky, which honestly would have been incredible for someone my age. I was already planning how I might use it, maybe a down payment on a house, or invest it for my future. My family was acting kind of weird in the days leading up to the will reading. They'd have these hushed conversations that would stop when I walked into the room, and everyone seemed nervous, but also excited. Like they knew something I didn't. Ashley kept making comments like, well, we'll see how Grandma really felt about everyone soon enough. And Uncle Richard was making these jokes about how he hoped Grandma remembered who was really there for her at the end. So we all gathered in Mr. Thompson's office on that Friday afternoon, and let me tell you, the tension in that room was thick. Everyone was trying to act normal, but you could feel this undercurrent of anticipation and anxiety. Mr. Thompson started by reading through the smaller bequests. Grandma left her jewelry to Mom, some family photos to Patricia, a few $1,000s to each of the grandchildren for educational purposes. Everyone was nodding along, seeming satisfied with these gifts. Then Mr. Thompson got to the main part of the will, and y'all, what he said next literally made my jaw drop. To my beloved granddaughter Jennifer, who has shown the most genuine love and care for me throughout my life, I leave the remainder of my estate, including my house and all financial assets, totaling approximately $3.2 million. The silence in that room was deafening. Like, you could have heard a pin drop. I'm sitting there in complete shock because I had no idea Grandma even had that much money, and everyone else is staring at me like I'd just stolen something from them. And then all hell broke loose. Patricia was the first to speak up, and she was furious. That can't be right, she said. Mother was confused at the end. She didn't know what she was doing when she made these decisions. Mom jumped in immediately. Jennifer, you had to have influenced her somehow. Grandma wouldn't have left everything to one person and basically nothing to her own daughters. Uncle Richard was practically yelling, this is ridiculous. Jennifer barely visited. We were the ones taking care of Eleanor every day. My cousins Brandon and Melissa were just sitting there looking stunned, but Ashley, oh my God, Ashley looked at me with this expression of pure hatred and said, you manipulated a sick old woman. You should be ashamed of yourself. I was so shocked I could barely speak. I kept saying, I had no idea. I didn't ask for this. I'm just as surprised as you are. But nobody was listening to me. Mr. Thompson tried to calm everyone down and explained that the will was perfectly legal, properly witnessed, and that Grandma had been evaluated by a doctor who confirmed her mental competency when she signed it. But my family was having none of it. They stormed out of that office making threats about contesting the will and getting justice, and how they wouldn't let this stand. The next few weeks were absolutely brutal, y'all. My family went from treating me like a beloved daughter and granddaughter to treating me like I was some kind of criminal who'd stolen from them. Mom called me every day demanding that I do the right thing and share the inheritance equally with everyone. She'd guilt trip me about how hard she'd worked to take care of Grandma, how she'd sacrificed to help with medical expenses, how disappointed Grandma would be if I was selfish. Ashley stopped speaking to me entirely. She'd post these passive-aggressive things on social media about family loyalty and people who forget where they came from. When mutual friends would ask about our family situation, she'd tell them I'd have stolen our grandmother's inheritance through manipulation. Patricia and Richard were even worse. They'd show up at my apartment unannounced, demanding to talk sense into me. They'd bring financial documents and try to prove that I owed the family money for expenses they'd covered for Grandma's care. Brandon and Melissa were more subtle. But they'd send me these long texts about how the inheritance could change so many lives and how I had the power to help the whole family, but was choosing to be selfish instead. But here's what really bothered me: instead of mourning Grandma together as a family, everyone was focused entirely on the money. No one was talking about her life, her legacy, or how much we'd miss her. It was all about dollars and cents. They started this coordinated pressure campaign to make me feel guilty about accepting the inheritance. They'd bring up every favor they'd ever done for me, every time they'd helped me out financially, every family gathering where they'd made me feel welcome. "Remember when we paid for your college graduation party?" Mom would say. "Remember when Patricia helped you move apartments? Remember when Richard fixed your car for free?" They made it seem like I owed them my inheritance because of their past kindness, which honestly made me feel horrible. These were people I loved, and they were making me feel like I was destroying our family by accepting what Grandma had chosen to give me. The worst part was that they were turning other family members and family friends against me. I'd hear through mutual acquaintances that my family was telling people I'd brainwashed a Grandma or isolated her from her daughters. After about a month of this constant pressure and guilt tripping, I started to get suspicious about why my family was so desperate to contest the will. See, if Grandma had really been mentally incompetent when she made her will, why hadn't they raised concerns at the time? Why had they allowed her to sign power of attorney documents and make other important decisions if they thought she wasn't capable? And some of their financial claims about expenses they'd covered for Grandma's care didn't add up. They kept mentioning these huge amounts they'd supposedly spent, but when I asked for receipts or documentation, they'd get evasive. So I decided to hire my own lawyer to help me understand my legal position and investigate whether my family's claims had any merit. My attorney, Sarah Mitchell, was this sharp woman who specialized in estate law and family disputes. When I explained the situation to her, she immediately suggested we do some investigation into the family's financial claims and their interactions with Grandma during her final months. "Jennifer," she told me, "if your family is being this aggressive about contesting a valid will, there might be more to this story than just disappointment about inheritance amounts." Y'all, what my lawyer discovered over the next few weeks was so much worse than just family greed over inheritance money. We're talking about systematic fraud, elder abuse, and financial crimes that had been going on for months before Grandma died. First, Sarah helped me get access to Grandma's financial records as the executor of her estate. What we found made me absolutely sick to my stomach. Over the 6 months before Grandma died, there had been dozens of unauthorized withdrawals from her bank accounts, totaling over $180,000. These weren't small amounts. We're talking about $5,000 here, $8,000 there, $12,000 for medical expenses that we couldn't find any documentation for. The signatures on the withdrawal slips looked like Grandma's, but a handwriting expert later confirmed that many of them were forgeries. Someone had been systematically stealing from a dying woman. But it gets worse. We also found evidence that someone had been using Grandma's credit cards to make personal purchases. Furniture for Uncle Richard's house, clothes shopping sprees, car payments, even a family vacation to Florida that my family had taken while claiming they were too busy caring for Grandma to travel. The credit card statements showed over $65,000 in fraudulent charges over those final 6 months. Remember how I mentioned that Mom and Patricia had convinced Grandma to give them power of attorney? Well, they'd been using that authority to move money around in ways that definitely weren't in Grandma's best interest. They'd transferred $40,000 from Grandma's savings account to pay off Uncle Richard's business debts. They'd used Grandma's money to pay for Brandon's graduate school tuition, not as a gift, but by forging documents that made it look like Grandma had requested the payment. Most shocking of all, they'd started the process of selling some of Grandma's real estate investments and transferring the proceeds to accounts controlled by family members. If Grandma had lived another few months, they probably would have succeeded in stealing most of her estate before she even died. But here's where it gets really criminal, y'all. Sarah's investigation uncovered evidence that my family had been planning to contest the will using forged documents. We found drafts of a new will on Uncle Richard's computer that supposedly showed Grandma leaving her estate equally to her daughters, with smaller amounts for the grandchildren. This fake will was dated just 2 weeks before Grandma died. They'd hired a disreputable lawyer named Martin Cross who specialized in contested estate cases and had apparently coached them on how to claim that Grandma had been mentally incompetent when she made her real will. The plan was to present the fake will along with testimony from family members about Grandma's confusion and memory problems to try to overturn her actual wishes. We also found emails between my family members discussing their strategy for proving that I had unduly influenced Grandma. They'd planned to claim that I'd isolated her from the family and manipulated her into changing her will. The most heartbreaking part of the investigation was discovering evidence that my family had been emotionally and financially abusing Grandma during her final months. Sarah helped me get access to the records from Carmen, the home health aide my family had hired. Carmen had been keeping detailed notes about Grandma's care, and what she documented was horrifying. My family had been limiting Grandma's contact with friends and other family members, claiming she was too confused for visitors. They'd been controlling her medications in ways that kept her more sedated and compliant than necessary. Most disturbing, Carmen's notes showed that my family members would have loud arguments in front of Grandma about her money and property, causing her significant distress. One note from Carmen said, "Mrs. Eleanor very upset today. Family arguing again about selling house. She keeps asking for Jennifer, but daughters say Jennifer too busy to visit." They'd been preventing Grandma from seeing me during her final months because they were afraid she might change her will again or tell me what they were doing. As Sarah dug deeper, we realized that this wasn't just opportunistic theft, this was a coordinated conspiracy involving multiple family members over many months. Mom, Patricia, and Richard had been the main planners, but Ashley, Brandon, and Melissa had all been aware of and participated in the scheme to various degrees. Ashley had helped forge Grandma's signature on several documents. Brandon had used his graduate school connections to find the corrupt lawyer. Melissa had been responsible for limiting my access to Grandma and spreading false stories about my manipulation. They divided up responsibilities and coordinated their stories to make their fraud as believable as possible. We found text message chains between all of them discussing their plans, celebrating successful thefts, and planning how to challenge the will. One text from Patricia to Mom said, "Got another $8,000 today. Eleanor was having a bad day and signed without questions. Richard says lawyer thinks we have good case for incompetency." Another text from Mom to Ashley said, "Make sure Jennifer doesn't visit this weekend. We're moving the bonds to Richard's account and don't want witnesses." By the time Sarah finished her investigation, we had enough evidence to prosecute my entire family for elder abuse, financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit forgery. The evidence included bank records showing $245,000 in unauthorized withdrawals and transfers, a credit card statements documenting $65,000 in fraudulent purchases, forged signatures on dozens of financial documents, draft copies of the fake will they'd planned to use, text messages and emails discussing their criminal plans, testimony from Carmen about the elder abuse, handwriting analysis proving signature forgery. Sarah told me this was one of the most comprehensive elder abuse cases she'd ever seen, with evidence that could result in serious prison time for everyone involved. Now, at this point, I had to make a really difficult decision. I could turn all this evidence over to law enforcement and watch my entire family get arrested and prosecuted. Or I could try to handle this privately and maybe preserve some relationships. Part of me still loved these people, despite what they'd done. They were my family, and the thought of sending my own mother and sister to prison was devastating. But then I thought about Grandma and how they'd abused and stolen from her during the most vulnerable time of her life. I thought about how they'd prevented her from seeing me when she was dying. I thought about how they'd been planning to steal her entire legacy and then lie about it in court. And I realized that these people weren't really my family anymore. They were criminals who'd preyed on an elderly woman and then tried to manipulate me into giving up what she'd left me. So I decided to pursue both criminal prosecution and civil litigation to make sure they faced full consequences for what they'd done. All right, gorgeous souls, this is where my family's entire scheme comes crashing down in the most spectacular way possible. Remember, these people had spent months planning to steal from Grandma and then manipulate me into giving up my inheritance. They thought they were so clever, but they'd made one huge mistake: they'd messed with the wrong granddaughter. First, I took all of Sarah's evidence to the district attorney's office and filed formal criminal complaints against every single family member who'd participated in the fraud. The DA, Michael Rodriguez, told me this was one of the most clear-cut elder abuse cases he'd seen in years. "We have documented evidence of systematic financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult," he said. "Your family is looking at serious felony charges." Within 2 weeks, criminal charges were filed against Mom, Patricia, Richard, and Ashley for elder abuse, financial exploitation, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Brandon and Melissa received lesser charges for their participation, but they were still facing potential jail time. The local news picked up the story because elder abuse cases involving this much money were pretty rare in our area. The headlines were brutal: local family accused of stealing $300,000 from dying mother, and grandmothers will reveals family's criminal conspiracy. Y'all, watching my family get arrested was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Mom was arrested at her job at the bank, which was absolutely humiliating for her. Her employer immediately suspended her pending the outcome of the criminal case, since they couldn't have someone charged with financial crimes working in banking. Patricia and Richard were arrested at their house early in the morning. The news footage showed them being led away in handcuffs while their neighbors watched. The shame was incredible. Ashley was arrested at her dental office, which meant her employer learned about the charges immediately. She was fired that same day because they couldn't risk having someone charged with fraud working in healthcare. The arraignments were covered by local media, and seeing my family members standing in front of a judge answering to criminal charges was just, wow. Each of them had to post bail ranging from $25,000 to $50,000, which completely wiped out their savings and forced them to get bail bondsmen. While the criminal cases were proceeding, Sarah filed massive civil lawsuits against all of them for elder abuse, conversion, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We weren't just seeking return of the money they'd stolen. We were going after punitive damages, emotional distress damages, and attorney's fees. The civil suits demanded $310,000 in stolen money and fraudulent charges, $500,000 in punitive damages for elder abuse, $300,000 for emotional distress to grandma, $200,000 for my emotional distress, all attorney's fees and court costs. Total demand $1.8 million in damages beyond just returning what they'd stolen. The legal fees alone started destroying my family's finances immediately. Mom had to hire a criminal defense attorney who charged $300 per hour. With the complexity of her case, she was looking at legal bills of at least $75,000, which was more money than she had. Patricia and Richard's construction business started failing because word of the criminal charges spread through their professional network. Clients canceled contracts, suppliers demanded cash payments, and they couldn't get bonding for new projects. Uncle Richard had to put their house up for sale to pay for legal fees, but the publicity from the case made it hard to find buyers. Ashley lost her job and couldn't find new employment in healthcare because background checks revealed her pending criminal charges. Brandon had to drop out of graduate school because his parents could no longer help with tuition, and the scandal made it impossible for him to get assistantships or financial aid. Melissa moved back in with her parents, but since they were about to lose their house, she ended up having to move in with friends. As the criminal cases proceeded, the story got picked up by larger media outlets because of the dramatic family betrayal angle. A true crime podcast contacted me about featuring the case, and several TV shows reached out about doing documentaries. The media attention was actually helpful for my legal cases because it put pressure on my family to accept plea deals rather than risk going to trial and getting even more publicity. But it was also really hard emotionally to have our family's dirty laundry aired in public. I got a lot of support from people who thought I was brave for standing up to elder abuse, but I also got criticism from people who thought I should have handled it privately. Faced with overwhelming evidence and mounting legal bills, my family members started accepting plea deals rather than risk going to trial. Mom pled guilty to elder abuse and financial exploitation and was sentenced to 18 months in prison plus 5 years probation. She also had to pay $85,000 in restitution. Patricia pled guilty to similar charges and got 15 months in prison plus probation and $70,000 in restitution. Richard got the harshest sentence, 2 years in prison, because he'd been the mastermind behind much of the financial fraud. Ashley pled guilty to forgery and got 6 months in jail plus 3 years probation and $25,000 in restitution. Brandon and Melissa got probation and community service, but they still had to pay restitution and had felony convictions on their records. The civil cases were resolved through a settlement agreement that gave me almost everything I'd asked for. Between the criminal restitution and the civil settlement, I recovered $310,000 for the money they'd stolen, $400,000 in punitive damages, $150,000 for emotional distress, $75,000 in attorney's fees, total recovery, $935,000 beyond just getting back what was stolen. My family had to liquidate almost everything they owned to pay the settlement, houses, cars, retirement accounts, everything. By the time everything was resolved, my family's lives had been completely destroyed. Mom lost her house, her job, her retirement savings, and spent 18 months in prison. She came out broke, unemployable in banking, and living in a tiny apartment. Patricia and Richard lost their house, their business, and their marriage couldn't survive the stress. They got divorced while Richard was in prison, and Patricia moved to another state to try to start over. Ashley lost her career in healthcare, couldn't find stable employment with a felony record, and had to move back in with mom in that tiny apartment. Brandon never finished graduate school and was working at a retail job to pay off his restitution. His criminal record made it nearly impossible to get professional employment. Melissa was working as a waitress and living paycheck to paycheck, also struggling with the felony conviction on her record. None of them could afford to maintain their previous lifestyles, and the family was completely fractured. They blamed each other for the scheme's failure and could barely stand to be in the same room together. Meanwhile, I was using Grandma's inheritance exactly the way she'd hoped I would. I invested most of the money in a diversified portfolio and used a portion to start my own marketing consulting business. Within 2 years, I'd grown the business to the point where I was making more money than I'd ever dreamed of. I also established a foundation in Grandma's memory that helps elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse. The foundation provides legal assistance to seniors and education about financial scams. The foundation has helped dozens of elderly people recover stolen money and protect themselves from family members and others who are trying to exploit them. I bought a beautiful house in Atlanta and created a life that I knew would make Grandma proud. I used her money to build something meaningful instead of just spending it on luxury items. The most satisfying part of this whole experience has been seeing how Grandma's will turned out to be perfect justice. She'd known exactly what kind of people my family members really were, and she'd chosen to leave her money to the one person who would honor her values and use it responsibly. While my family was plotting to steal from her, Grandma was quietly making sure her legacy would go to someone who deserved it. Today, 5 years later, I'm successful, happy, and surrounded by friends who genuinely care about me rather than my bank account. My criminal family members are still struggling with the consequences of their choices. They lost everything: money, relationships, reputations, and freedom. Sometimes I get emails from cousins or other relatives asking if I'd consider helping out family members who are struggling financially. My answer is always the same: they chose greed over family, and actions have consequences. I learned that blood doesn't make people family, love, respect, and integrity make people family. And anyone who would steal from a dying grandmother and then try to manipulate her grieving granddaughter doesn't deserve to be called family. Grandma was right to trust me with her legacy, and I made sure that everyone who betrayed that trust paid the ultimate price. That's how you handle family greed, y'all. You don't just get mad, you get evidence, you get justice, and you make sure that people who prey on vulnerable elderly family members face the full consequences of their crimes.